The age-old question, how do I develop my ideas into finished tracks? Well, the good news is the answer was solved a couple hundred years ago. Even if you haven't spent a lot of time studying classical music, or any at all, maybe you hate classical music, doesn't matter, you've probably at least heard of a sonata. Now, stick with me here because this directly affects how you can make your own music feel more focused and impactful, more coherent. The concept is really foundational. You see, a sonata is not just something that composers wrote a lot of because they couldn't think of clever names to call their pieces. A sonata is a specific form. It's a specific structure that composers could use as a framework to decorate with their own material. So I guess a good analogy might be a sonnet in poetry. There's a certain structure to it. And in those limitations, you find creative things to push against and to make your own within that set structure. This is an incredibly fast breakdown of sonata form, just so that you can get an idea of how it works and what it actually is. It's very effective. There are three major sections. There's an exposition, that's the big A section. There's the one we're going to focus on today, the B section, which is called the development. That's a pretty important term. And then there's the return of the A section, which is called, appropriately, the recap or the recapitulation. In the exposition, you state your themes. Usually there were two of them in sonata form. And in the exposition, those themes come back. They are reiterated in an almost exact way. Maybe in different keys, but that's another story for another time. But the point is, we have identifiable themes that are repeated later in a way that is meant for you to identify them. There's a lesson there too. They don't change things just for the sake of changing them. They make things that are so strong we want to hear them again. But what I really want to focus on today is that B section, that development, because that's the really juicy, meaty part of sonata form to me, where the most creative things happen. And it's how we can start to come up with B sections or other sections to go with our A section, our initial loop, our initial idea that we really like, and develop it so that it feels like a complete piece of music. See, when composers come to the end of the A section, the exposition, they don't start over. They don't throw everything out and start fresh, like, oh, now I've got to come up with something new. What in the world do I do? A lot of times when we do that with our own tracks, with our own pieces, we end up with something that doesn't sound like it belongs with the A section at all, right? It starts to lose cohesiveness and just sounds like we've started a new track. I've certainly been there. That's why we just stay in the same loop and repeat that over and over. We don't know how to develop it in a way that feels contrasting and yet also connected to the material we already have. But composers back in the day, they would ask themselves a question when they came to their development section that is super important and super fascinating, and I still use to this day. How can I reuse what I've already done in new and interesting ways? Not start over, but use what I've already done. This is the embodiment of what I am constantly saying on this channel. Do more with less. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and feel like you've got to start over when you come to a new section. Look back at what you've already done, to the strongest elements of what you've already done, and see what you can mine from that. So when a composer would come to a development back in the day, and today, they would say, what are some fragments of those themes that I can chop up into little motifs? What's a fragment of my progression? What's a fragment of my left-hand accompaniment, if it's a piano piece? How can I chop these things up and rearrange them? It's like throwing their best motifs and gestures from the A section into a musical blender for the development. And these fragments, they might overlap each other in interesting ways. They might alternate. You know, they may take the first phrase from the first theme and juxtapose that with the second phrase from the second theme. And this creates little musical conversations between parts of the different themes. They might do them backwards. They might flip them upside down. There's a lot of compositional tools that we can use to get variation out of material we already have. Let me show you what I mean in a brand new piece that I just wrote and released a couple weeks ago. This is a waltz where I have a very clear ABA form, and it is essentially sonata form, a very truncated, shortened version. because my B section is really a development, just like I've described here. So let me show you some of these things in action. So the very first phrase in my A section sounds like this. And my B section sounds like this. You can probably hear some elements from the A section in there right away, but I'm going to show you that the entirety of the B section is born out of that A section, maybe in some ways that might be hidden. Now, that gesture, right at the very end of that very first idea of the A section, very different. I've got a tiny little half step there, which is different than what I've established, which is big leaps in the melody so far. So I want to take out the part that's different. That stands out to me, the part that is not like everything else. And I want to do something interesting with it in the development. So what could I do? What if I did that backwards? Just those 3 notes. That's an interesting gesture. That is retrograde, which just means backwards, okay? It's a retrograde version of that little melodic idea that I have right there in the A section. So if you listen to the beginning of my B section again with that in mind, it's not exactly the same. I've made the interval larger. But each one of those 3-note gestures came from that initial idea. It was mined from my A section. Now, I've transposed it. It's in a different key now. It's reharmonized in a different way, all using only 3 notes ever sounding at a time, by the way. That's another story for another day, too. Notice how it's all ascending patterns in my B section to start off. And notice how everything in the A section, and those first 4 bars, is descending. I call that thematic juxtaposition, which just means I'm looking for my A section and B section main ideas, themes, to sort of do the opposite of each other, sort of fit together like pieces of a puzzle. So where one is descending, I might think, okay, how can I do something ascending for the B section? And then you notice that I just literally reiterate the A section theme when I get to the top of that ascending line in the B section. Once again, it's reharmonized. It's in a different key area. Those are all things that we can do for variation, but it clearly, I want it to call back to the A section. But the point is, everything in this B section was born out of my A section theme. So rather than starting from scratch, which by the way, I did, when I got to the B section, I didn't follow my own advice. I had to remind myself, oh, maybe I should go back and look at the things that I've already done. And that is what really brought this piece together. And I really love the way that the piece came together. By the way, you can listen to it through the link in the description down below if you'd like. So you may be thinking to yourself, well, that's great, but I don't write solo piano music. So what do I care what this guy who is writing solo piano music has to say about it? Well, I don't just write solo piano music. I write electronic music as well. And I found this to be a really helpful concept, a really helpful technique to use in any style of music, any kind of music that I'm writing. Looking back to the things that I've already done and mining from those things. So when I create a synth sequence, I'm looking for these things like, what are the interesting parts of the sequence that is different than the rest of the sequence that I can pluck out and use somewhere else as the foundation of a melody or a lead line or a bass line. Those are always the things that I mine from stuff that I've already done that I really like, that tie my pieces together, tie my tracks together in ways that I'm usually the most satisfied with. Now, you may be thinking to yourself, well, how did you arrive at this particular variation? How did you figure it out? Well, you try things. Unfortunately, there's no shortcut to that part of it. But having some things to try, like understanding that I can look back at my old material, pluck things out, do it retrograde, invert it, do it upside down, backwards. Those concepts and ideas give me a starting point. And that I find to be much more effective than just sitting around waiting for inspiration or just blindly trying things, hoping to stumble upon something that I like. If I start with this framework, start with the idea of development, just like in sonata form, then I feel like I'm not grasping at straws. I have a much better chance of finding something through experimentation that I like and that fits with what I've already done really well. Feels like a natural development. So hopefully this gives you some inspiration for ways that you can look at the things that you've already done that you like, those loops that you're trying to break out of. Ask yourself how you can use it, how you can develop it into something connected, something coherent, something focused and intentional. I've compiled some of my favorite compositional concepts into a free downloadable ebook that's going to be linked in the description down below. If you want to grab that, tens of thousands of people have downloaded it and have really enjoyed the read. So it's a quick read, but we'll give you some actionable things like this in more detail. And there's also a reason why I still like starting with the notes rather than the sound design most of the time when I'm writing even my electronic music. And it's because strong musical ideas are easier to develop. And that's exactly what I'll show you how to do in this next video right here, if you want to check that out.